Pierre du Moulin himself responded to the teachings of Amyraut. Now, by 1637, the French Reformed Church was in an uproar. By that time, a number of provincial synods had taken decisions against Amyraldian theology. Amyraut himself was brought up on charges of heresy, of teaching Arminianism, before the National Synod of Alençon in 1637, or Alençon, I'm not sure how you say that word. The theological faculty at Leiden sent a letter approving of the synopsis of Revet, which had critiqued Amyraldianism. In other words, the Dutch Reformed ministers and theologians in Leiden were against Amyraldianism. They understood that it was in conflict with the canons of Dort. Also, the seminary at Sedan, where du Moulin was the professor, sent a work by du Moulin to the synod. Also, the Reformed churches in Geneva sent a letter encouraging the French to condemn any teachings contrary to the Synod of Dort, and they felt that the teaching of the Amyraldians did contradict the Synod of Dort. They also, very interestingly, expressed their unhappiness with the fact that Amyraut had claimed that John Calvin taught the doctrine of universal grace. Now, at the Synod, Amyraut and his fellow Amyraldians tried to explain away their conditional predestination by saying that by this terminology they understood and meant nothing more than the will of God as revealed in his word. That is, the will which gives life to whoever would believe. And they explained that the term conditional was used only as an anthropomorphism, as Brian Armstrong points out. Amyraut dissimulated. He really told some stretchers here. Roger Nicole discusses how Amyraut tried to conform his language as closely as he could to the traditional Reformed views without making an outright disavowal of what he had published previously. But Nicole says it would be difficult to maintain that they were wholly free, that is, Amyraut and his friends, of dissimulation in this matter. For instance, it seems fairly obvious, Nicole says, that their printed utterances were ill in keeping with the canons of the Synod of Dort. Nicole thinks that either Amyraut was not very forthright or he didn't grasp well the implications of his ideas. Now, the Synod accepted the explanation of Amyraut that the controversy was more semantic, just over words. Therefore, the Synod didn't discipline them. Now, in the 20th century, some scholars have claimed that this shows that the teaching of Amyraldianism is actually somehow been a legitimate position to hold in the history of the Reformed churches. But actually, if you look closely at what the Synod does, you find that the Synod actually takes a stand against phrases that the Amyraldians used, which of course have ideas that are Amyraldian behind them. What the Synod did is they told them to stop using and retract certain phrases. They had to stop using certain languages. They weren't just vindicated. The Synod did not find him guilty of teaching contrary to the Synod of Dort, to which he had ascribed, but there were reasons for this. And the main reason, the basic reason, was the fragile situation of the French Reformed churches in France. A split or the deposition, split of the churches or the deposition of Amyraut would have had devastating consequences in the French Reformed churches. It would have shipwrecked the Reformed Academy at Saumur, which was the largest seminary in France. Attempts on the part of both sides to reduce the explosive nature of this controversy played a role in this. Now, what happened is that the Synod said Amyraut and his fellows had to stop using Arminian language. Now listen to what Amyraut agreed not to say. He agreed not to speak of God as having vehement desires of things which he hath not. Now notice that speaks to the fact that he's claiming that God has desires, for example, to save all human beings. The Synod says you shouldn't talk as if God has some vehement desire to save all human beings. Also, the synod directed him to retract a phrase that implied that Christ died equally for everyone. So it's not like the French Reformed Synod supported this kind of statement. He was also told to be more prudent when speaking anthropologically about God. That was the same game, remember, that Arminius played. The synod also told him to use the term voluntas, or will, when speaking about conditionals and revocables instead of the word decree. Here the synod is recognizing that he's playing some games with the word decree, and how we need to distinguish between God's decree and something that is a conditional. The synod also decreed that he ought not to publish anything on this controversy. He needed to stop his public advocacy for Amyrauldianism. The synod censured some of the language he used, prohibiting him to use language like conditional decrees. The synod is not supporting his teaching about conditional decrees, like a conditional decree of God's desire to elect everybody in an antecedent decree. Also, Amyraut's teaching about a twofold predestination was so offensive to the Orthodox Reformed at the synod that he was forced to stop using the language of predestination to salvation to refer to a hypothetical decree, and then predestination to faith to refer to an unconditional decree of election. The French Reformed Synod didn't want him to talk about an anterior or earlier decree that was unfulfilled and conditional and universal as predestination to salvation. The synod is not supporting his idea of an anterior, conditional, universal desire to save all human beings. Following the synod, Amyraut avoided using some of his earlier terminology, which had been basically condemned, but he continued to speak about a twofold mercy in God, upon which was based a twofold will of God. So he wasn't cured of his disease. Now, the synod forbade any further discussions on these controversial questions, and therefore Reformed pastors in France, or theologians, could not write publicly on the issue. But you couldn't keep this issue in a box, because international Reformed theologians, of course, also were dealing with this issue. In the Helvetic Consensus Formula of 1675, the Swiss Reformed rejected Amyrauldianism. Now, one of the leading theologians in Geneva at that time was Francis Turretini. And in Zurich, a leading theologian was J.H. Heidegger. Now, both of those men were very troubled by Amyrauldianism. These two men played a role in drawing up this consensus formula for the Swiss Reformed churches. It included a statement of faith that would be required to be signed by all Swiss preachers. We are now in really the closing decades of the church in Switzerland and in Geneva, for example, being confessional and orthodox. As you come to the end of the 1600s and move into the 1700s, you discover that apostasy begins to come into those churches in Switzerland. But at this time yet, the churches are standing up for what is biblical and reformational and confessional. The formula Consensus Ecclesiarum Helveticarum opposed the Amyraldian idea of a universal hypothetical grace, and it did this in 16 of its 26 articles. Now, some people want to claim, once again, that somehow it's okay to hold to Amyrauldianism and be a member and minister in one of the Reformed churches. Yes, it's true, they got away with it in France. The Dutch Reformed churches didn't support this, and the Reformed Church in Geneva, the birthplace of the Reformed churches, certainly did not support it. So for 50 years, while the Swiss churches remained confessional Reformed, pastors needed to sign agreement with this formula, and 16 of its 26 articles rejected Amyrauldianism. Now, in the Netherlands, Amyrauldianism was viewed as an attack on the canons of Dort and a compromise with Arminian theology. Now, listen to what the consensus formula in Switzerland says. Now, responding to the idea of a universal conditional election, the Swiss pastors signed Article 6, which says, "Wherefore we cannot give suffrage to the opinion of those who teach, one, that God, moved by philanthropy or a sort of special love for the fallen human race, to previous election did, in a kind of conditioned willingness, first moving a pity, as they call it, in efficacious desire, purpose the salvation of all and each, at least conditionally, i.e. if they would believe. 2, that he appointed Christ the mediator for all and each of the fallen. And 3, that at length certain ones, whom he regarded not simply as sinners in the first Adam, but as redeemed in the second Adam, he elected." Notice what's going on there. The confession rejects the idea of an antecedent conditional will of God. And the reason is because the scriptures do not extend unto all and each God's purpose of showing mercy to man, but restrict it to the elect alone, the reprobate being excluded, even by name, as Esau, whom God hated with an eternal hatred. That's how Article 6 ends. In Article 16, the consensus statement says, "We cannot approve the contrary doctrine of those who affirm that of his own intention, by his own counsel, and that of the Father who sent him, Christ died for all and each upon the impossible condition, provided they believe, that he obtained for all a salvation which nevertheless is not applied to all, and by his death merited salvation and faith for no one individually and certainly." And then in Article 13, the Swiss Reformed pastors rejected a universal atonement. Article 13 reads, "For according to the determinate counsel of the Father and his own intention, he encountered dreadful death instead of the elect alone, restored only these into the bosom of the Father's grace, and these only he reconciled to God. For our Jesus saves his people from their sins." Matthew 1:21, "who gave his life a ransom for many sheep." Accordingly, in the death of Christ, only the elect who in time are made new creatures, and for whom Christ in his death was substituted as an expiatory sacrifice, are regarded as having died with him, as being justified from sin, and thus with the counsel of the Father, who gave to Christ none but the elect to be redeemed. So notice how this consensus formula very, very strongly stood up for particular redemption and unconditional election. And so we come to the end of the story of Pierre du Moulin. Pierre du Moulin served the Reformed churches by first standing up against the dominant Roman Catholicism in France, being a courageous witness to the gospel and the doctrines of grace. And then in his Anatomy of Arminianism, he dealt with the controversies that rose in the Netherlands. And then finally, towards the end of his career, he had to sadly deal with the issue of the semi-Arminians who were teaching Amyrauldianism in France. But Pierre du Moulin was a man to be praised for his sacrifices, for his courage, for his clarity, and for his love of the supremacy of God and his marvelous grace in election. That's why the American church should remember Pierre du Moulin.